They called it the Infinite Council, a gathering of civilizations so ancient that their languages predated starlight itself. For 12,000 years, they had maintained order across 7 spiral arms, arbitrating disputes between species, who had long forgotten what it meant to raise a weapon in anger. The Valkyrie brought wisdom carved from crystal consciousness. The Thornweave offered logic distilled through quantum meditation spanning millennia. The architects of prison shaped reality itself to demonstrate the futility of conflict. These were beings who had transcended the primitive urges that plague younger races, or so they believed, until the day the war horns of the Kreshtar Horde shattered the silence of 10,000 years. The Horde came from the void between galaxies, a swarm consciousness that consumed everything in its path, leaving only sterile rock and darkness behind. They had devoured 43 galaxies before they set their hunger upon ours. When they breached the Sagittarius barrier, the Infinite Council convened for the first time in 3 centuries, and their decision was unanimous and absolute. The galaxy would need a champion, a species willing to do what the enlightened could not, what the civilized would not. They needed predators. They needed humanity. We had been part of the galactic community for barely 2 centuries when the summons came. Ambassador Chen stood in the Hall of Eternal Deliberation, a structure built from solidified time itself, and listened as the eldest beings in the universe explained why they had chosen us. The Valkyrie Chancellor, a being of pure thought housed in crystalline form, spoke with a voice that resonated through dimensions humans couldn't even perceive. "You are young," it said, and the words carried the weight of genuine sorrow. "You have not yet learned to set aside the violent impulses that governed your evolution. You still remember what it means to hunt, to fight, to die for something greater than yourselves. Your people wage war not as a calculation, but as an expression of will. This quality, which we have spent eons transcending, is precisely what this moment demands." Chen felt the eyes of 1,000 species upon her, each of them ancient beyond measure, each of them looking at humanity with something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite pity. It was recognition. They saw in us what they had buried in themselves so deep that it could never be recovered. They saw the predator. The proposal was simple in its horror. Humanity would lead the defense of the galaxy against the Kreshtar Horde. We would be given access to technologies that made our most advanced weapons look like sharpened sticks. We would command fleets drawn from every species in the Council, billions of ships crewed by beings who had forgotten how to die for a cause. And in exchange, if we survived, humanity would have a seat on the Infinite Council, a voice in shaping the destiny of trillions. If we refused, the elder races would retreat to their pocket dimensions and encoded realities, leaving the younger species, including humanity, to face the Horde alone. It wasn't really a choice at all. Chen looked at the assembled representatives of humanity's military, political, and cultural leadership who had been summoned alongside her. She saw Admiral Okonkwo, whose grandmother had fought in Earth's last global conflict. She saw General Zhang, who had commanded the defense of the Martian colonies against the automated defense systems that had nearly exterminated humanity's first off-world settlements. She saw in their eyes the same thing the Infinite Council saw. The predator, wounded but unbroken, ready to hunt one more time. "We accept," Chen said, and though her voice was barely a whisper, it echoed through the Hall of Eternal Deliberation like a declaration of war. The council members shifted in ways that defied conventional physics, their relief palpable even across the vast gulf of biology and consciousness that separated them from humanity. They were afraid, these ancient beings who had witnessed the birth and death of stars. They were afraid, and they were grateful that humanity was not. Within hours, the largest military mobilization in galactic history began. Humanity's combined military forces, numbering barely 3 million personnel, would be reinforced by conscripts and volunteers from 600 allied species. Ships that had served as museum pieces and monuments were reactivated and retrofitted with weapons systems that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Entire star systems were converted into manufacturing hubs, their resources stripped and reformed into the instruments of war. And at the center of it all stood humanity, the youngest species in the Council, the most primitive by every objective measure, preparing to teach the galaxy what it had forgotten. The Kreshtar horde arrived at the Corvallis line 3 months later, a wall of living ships that stretched across 14 light-years, each vessel a nightmare of biological engineering, grown from the consumed essence of countless extinct civilizations. They moved as one organism, a swarm consciousness so vast that individual ships were merely cells in a body that spanned solar systems. Their hunger was not metaphorical. They literally consumed matter and energy, breaking it down into its component parts and incorporating it into their ever-expanding biomass. They had no culture, no art, no philosophy. They were appetite given form, and they had never encountered anything that could stand against them for long. But they had never encountered humanity. The first battle lasted 17 minutes. That's how long it took for the Kreshtar vanguard to annihilate the Valkyrie defensive fleet at the outer markers. 300 ships crewed by beings who had not trained for combat in 6,000 years, piloted by artificial intelligences programmed for every scenario except genuine war. The Valkyrie dissolved into their quantum consciousness, transmitted across the galaxy to safety, leaving behind empty crystalline ships that drifted like cosmic tombstones. The Thornweave attempted to negotiate, broadcasting complex mathematical proofs demonstrating the logical superiority of peaceful coexistence. The Horde's response was to consume their envoy ship whole, adding Thornweave genetic sequences to their ever-expanding biological library. The architects of Prism tried to reshape reality around the Horde, bending space and time to create impassable barriers. The Horde simply waited, patient as entropy, until the architects exhausted themselves maintaining the barriers, then flowed through the gaps like water finding cracks in stone. 3 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, defeated in less than a day. And humanity watched, studied, and learned. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the UNSS Indomitable, flagship of humanity's contribution to the defense fleet, and felt something that the elder races had long forgotten. She felt alive. The fear was there, certainly, a cold weight in her stomach that reminded her of her first combat drop on Europa, when she was just a lieutenant leading a squad against automated defenses that calculated her death with mathematical precision. But beneath the fear was something stronger, something that evolution had burned into human DNA across 1,000,000 years of survival against impossible odds. The will to fight. Not because logic dictated it, not because some algorithm had determined it was optimal, but because giving up meant extinction, and extinction was unacceptable. "All ships, this is Indomitable Actual," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to order. "Execute Huntsman Protocol. Show them what happens when predators meet prey that's forgotten how to run." The human fleet, small by galactic standards, but crude by personnel who had trained their entire lives for this moment, surged forward. Behind them came the Allied forces, 600 species represented, billions of souls, who looked to humanity for leadership because humanity still remembered something they had lost. The Kreshtar horde perceived the human advance and responded with the same tactics that had conquered 43 galaxies. They formed a kill sphere, a 3-dimensional formation designed to envelope and consume enemy forces from all angles simultaneously. It had never failed. Against humanity, it was suicide. Human tactical doctrine had evolved from a simple premise: in space, there is no up, no down, no terrain to hold or ground to defend. There is only movement, angles, and the willingness to trade losses for victory. The elder races fought to minimize casualties, to preserve their people at all costs. Humanity fought to win. The difference was everything. Human ships dove into the Kreshtar formation at velocities that would have torn apart vessels designed by species who valued safety over speed. They used something the elder races had never considered. Ramming attacks augmented by weapons that turned entire ships into kinetic projectiles wrapped in nuclear fire. The Horde, accustomed to enemies who valued their own survival, couldn't comprehend an attack doctrine that treated ships and crews as ammunition. 17 human vessels were destroyed in the first exchange, taking 12,000 lives with them. But they eliminated 3,000 Kreshtar bioships in the process, a kill ratio that no elder race had ever achieved. The Horde adapted, as it always did, growing armor that could withstand kinetic impacts, developing point defense systems that tracked human missiles with perfect precision. It learned the patterns of human attack, predicted trajectories with increasing accuracy, began to match human aggression with its own evolutionary responses. And that's when humanity revealed the truth that the elder races had forgotten. Adaptation is not the same as innovation. The Kreshtar could evolve biological solutions to known problems. They could not imagine solutions that had never existed before. Humans could. The second wave of human attacks came from directions the Horde's biology couldn't have predicted because they violated basic tactical logic. Ships emerged from behind stellar objects at vectors that should have been gravitationally impossible, using slingshot maneuvers calculated on the fly by human pilots who trusted their instincts more than their instruments. Weapons fired at targets that didn't exist yet, anticipating where Horde bioships would be based on predictive models built from studies of Terran swarm insects, a connection no computational mind would have made. And most devastatingly, humanity employed deception, a concept that simply didn't exist in the Horde's collective consciousness. False signals, holographic projections, entire phantom fleets that drew Horde forces into kill zones where human ships waited in perfect ambush. The Battle of the Corvallis Line lasted 6 days. When it ended, the Kreshtar Horde had lost 40% of its vanguard force. Humanity had lost a third of its fleet. By every objective measure used by the elder races, it was a disaster, casualties far too high for the outcome achieved. By human standards, it was the first significant victory against an enemy that had never known defeat. More importantly, it proved something that no amount of ancient wisdom could refute. Humanity was not just willing to fight. Humanity knew how to win. Admiral Okonkwo stood among the survivors, exhausted beyond measure, mourning the thousands of dead whose names she would carry for the rest of her life, and felt something shift in the galaxy itself. The elder races were watching, not with pity anymore, but with something approaching awe. They were beginning to remember what they had forgotten, beginning to understand what humanity had never lost. The predator doesn't just hunt. The predator teaches others to remember their teeth. The Infinite Council reconvened in the aftermath of Corvallis, and for the first time in their long history, they asked a younger species for instruction. General Zhang stood before beings who had shaped the fundamental forces of reality and explained humanity's strategy with words that had not been spoken in the Hall of Eternal Deliberation for 10,000 years. "We don't fight to survive," she said, her voice carrying the weight of every human who had ever stood against impossible odds. "We fight to make the enemy regret starting the fight in the first place. Survival is the baseline. Victory is the goal. And victory means the complete elimination of the threat, regardless of cost." The Valkyrie Chancellor pulsed with colors that human eyes couldn't quite process, emotions beyond human comprehension rippling through its crystalline form. "You speak of destruction with such certainty," it said, and there was wonder in its voice. "How do you bear the weight of those you sacrifice?" Zhang looked at the ancient being, at the assembled representatives of 1,000 species, who had long ago chosen enlightenment over effectiveness, and she smiled with an expression that was both gentle and terrible. "We remember them," she said simply. "Every single one. We carry their names, tell their stories, honor their sacrifice. They don't die for nothing. They die so that others can live. That's not a burden. That's purpose." The council members absorbed this concept, trying to reconcile it with philosophies that had guided them for millennia. The Thornweave representative, a being of pure energy constrained by mathematical principles, spoke next. "This approach you describe, this willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of absolute victory, it contradicts every principle of rational warfare. The optimal strategy is always to minimize loss while achieving objectives." Zhang nodded, acknowledging the logic. "You're right. By every rational calculation, our tactics are inefficient. We lose more than we should. We take risks that don't make mathematical sense. But warfare isn't mathematics. It's psychology, it's will, it's the willingness to make the enemy believe that defeating you will cost more than they're willing to pay. The Kreshtar have never faced an enemy willing to die to hurt them. They've consumed galaxies full of species trying to survive. We're not trying to survive. We're trying to make them extinct." The word hung in the air like a declaration of divine judgment. Extinct. The other races had spent eons moving past such primitive concepts, had built their civilization on the premise that all life was sacred, that even enemies could be rehabilitated or contained. Humanity was proposing genocide against a species that was itself a genocidal force, fighting extinction with extinction. It should have been abhorrent. Instead, the council found themselves nodding in agreement. The strategy that emerged from that meeting would be remembered as the Apex Protocol, though historians would debate whether the name referred to humanity's position at the apex of the galactic predator hierarchy or to the apex of moral compromise that the elder races made in adopting it. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Humanity would lead strike forces deep into Horde-controlled space, targeting not the swarm ships themselves, but the biological factories where the Horde grew its vessels, the consumption nodes where it processed captured matter, the neural nexuses that coordinated swarm intelligence across light years. The goal wasn't to defeat the Horde in open battle. It was to starve it, cripple it, force it to choose between advancing and maintaining its supply lines. And humanity knew exactly how to execute such a strategy because humanity had done it before, on Earth, in wars fought with chemical explosives and steel ships, wars where the ability to disrupt enemy logistics had decided the fate of nations. The elder races provided the technology: ships that could fold space, weapons that could crack planets, defensive systems that bent probability itself. Humanity provided something technology couldn't create: the doctrine, the tactics, the willingness to venture into the void and fight without hope of reinforcement or retreat. The first deep strike launched from the rally point at Kepler Station, a massive construct built from the fused remains of 17 destroyed ships, a monument to the fallen that served as humanity's forward command post. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez led the strike force, 300 ships crewed by volunteers who understood they likely wouldn't return. Her grandfather had been a fighter pilot in Earth's last World War. Her mother had commanded the defense of the lunar colonies during the AI crisis. Violence and sacrifice were her inheritance, passed down through generations, who had survived because someone was willing to fight. The strike force jumped into Horde space using technology the elder races had developed for exploration and research, now weaponized by human ingenuity. They emerged in the Caracas Nebula, where Horde intelligence indicated a major biological manufacturing complex, a structure the size of a small moon that birthed 1,000 bioships every day. It was defended by forces that outnumbered Martinez's strike fleet 50 to 1. she didn't care about the odds. She cared about the mission. The battle that followed became the template for human warfare doctrine throughout the rest of the war. Martinez's ships didn't engage the defending Horde forces directly. Instead, they executed a series of hit-and-run attacks designed to draw defenders away from the manufacturing complex, using human pilots' superior tactical creativity to exploit gaps in Horde formation that artificial intelligence would never have recognized. When the defenders pursued, human ships fled not randomly, but according to carefully calculated vectors that maximized enemy confusion. And when the defending force was sufficiently dispersed, Martinez ordered the deployment of weapons that the elder races had built but never used. Reality-fracture devices that literally tore apart the fabric of space-time in localized areas, creating pockets of non-existence that consumed everything they touched. The Horde manufacturing complex, structure and all, simply ceased to exist, deleted from reality by weapons that made nuclear devices look like children's toys. Martinez lost 60 ships in the operation, 18,000 personnel, who died knowing they had struck a blow that would echo across the galaxy. The Horde lost the equivalent of a year's worth of production capacity. More importantly, they learned that humanity could strike anywhere, anytime, and that no Horde facility was safe. Fear, that most primitive of emotions, entered the swarm consciousness for the first time in its existence. The war transformed from a defensive holding action into a systematic dismantling of Horde infrastructure, and humanity was the surgeon wielding the scalpel. Over the next 2 years, human-led strike forces destroyed 47 major Horde facilities, disrupted supply lines across 14 sectors, and demonstrated tactics that forced the Horde to divert increasingly large portions of its swarm to defensive operations. The elder races, witnessing human effectiveness, began to remember their own capacity for violence. Valkyrie ships started mounting weapons alongside their meditation chambers. The Thornweave developed combat algorithms that prioritized victory over survival. The architects of Prism learned to reshape reality not just to create barriers, but to craft kill zones that trapped Horde forces in spatial loops from which there was no escape. Humanity had done more than lead the defense. Humanity had taught the galaxy how to be dangerous again. But the Horde was learning too, and what it learned was terrifying. The Kreshtar had conquered 43 galaxies by being the ultimate adaptive organism, and humanity's tactics, effective as they were, provided the Horde with new evolutionary paths. Horde bioships began to exhibit behaviors that suggested independent thought, breaking from swarm patterns to execute flanking maneuvers and ambushes that mimic human tactical doctrine. Horde facilities developed defensive strategies that showed signs of deception, creating false targets and hidden reserves. Most disturbing of all, the Horde began taking prisoners, something it had never done in its entire history of conquest. Not to consume, but to study, to learn, to understand what made humanity so effective at warfare. The first reports of Horde experimentation on captured humans came from the Arcturus sector, where a rescue operation found the remains of a destroyed human ship and its crew, bodies altered in ways that suggested the Horde was trying to incorporate human neural structures into its own biology. The implications were staggering. If the Horde succeeded in merging human tactical thinking with its own adaptive capacity, the galaxy would face an enemy that combined swarm intelligence with human creativity, an unstoppable force that would make their previous conquests look like training exercises. Admiral Okonkwo received the reports in her ready room aboard Indomitable, and for the first time since the war began, she felt genuine despair. Not fear, not exhaustion, but the crushing weight of having unleashed something that couldn't be contained. By teaching the galaxy how to fight, by demonstrating human warfare's effectiveness, humanity had given the Horde a template for evolution that could destroy everything. She was reviewing casualty reports, 3 million human military personnel reduced to less than half that number, when Ambassador Chen entered without ceremony or announcement. Chen looked older, the weight of 2 years of war having added decades to her appearance, but her eyes still held the fire that had made her say, "We accept," when the Council had asked humanity to become the galaxy's weapon. "I know what you're thinking," Chen said, sitting down across from Okonkwo without waiting for permission. "You're thinking we made a mistake. That by fighting, we've created something worse than what we faced originally." Okonkwo nodded, too tired to dissemble. "The Horde is incorporating our tactics. If they succeed in merging human cognitive patterns with their swarm intelligence, we'll have created the perfect predator. One that has our cunning and their numbers." Chen was quiet for a moment, then smiled with an expression that reminded Okonkwo why humanity had been chosen in the first place. "Then we make sure they don't succeed. And if they do, we remind them why humanity earned the title of apex predator in the first place." The plan that emerged from that conversation would be called the Omega Gambit, though military historians would debate whether it was brilliant strategy or desperate madness. The premise was simple. If the Horde wanted to understand humanity, humanity would give them understanding, a comprehensive education in human nature that would teach them the most important lesson. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't tactics or technology or even courage. It was the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory, including humanity itself. Admiral Okonkwo proposed a false intelligence leak that would suggest humanity had developed a weapon capable of destroying the Horde's central consciousness, the neural nexus that coordinated the swarm across galaxies. The intelligence would indicate this weapon required time to deploy, that humanity was vulnerable during its activation, and that striking the human homeworld of Earth would prevent the weapon's use. Every part of the intelligence would be true except the most important detail. The weapon didn't destroy the Horde's consciousness. It destroyed everything, a reality fracture device scaled up to unprecedented levels, powerful enough to create a wound in space-time that would expand until it consumed the entire galactic sector. If the Horde took the bait and sent its full force to Earth, humanity would detonate the device and eliminate both the Horde and humanity in a mutual extinction that would save the galaxy. The Infinite Council heard the proposal in stunned silence. The Valkyrie Chancellor spoke first, its voice carrying harmonics of horror and awe. "You would sacrifice your entire species? Your homeworld, your history, everything you built? This is beyond courage. This is extinction volunteered." Okonkwo stood before the assembled elder races, representing a species that had existed for barely 1,000,000 years, speaking to beings who had witnessed the birth of stars, and she felt no shame in what she proposed. Humanity has faced extinction before. We've been reduced to a few thousand individuals, driven to the edge of annihilation by ice ages and supervolcanoes and our own stupidity. We survived because we were willing to risk everything to ensure some part of us continued. If sacrificing Earth and all of us means the galaxy survives, means the other species get their chance to thrive, then that's not tragedy. That's purpose. That's what it means to be humanity. The Council deliberated for 3 days, the longest discussion in their recorded history. When they emerged, their decision was unanimous. The Omega Gambit would proceed, with one modification: humanity would not face extinction alone. Every species in the Council pledged ships and personnel to defend Earth, not because strategy required it, but because humanity had taught them something more valuable than tactics. Humanity had taught them honor. The battle began at the heliopause, where the first wave of Horde bioships met the outer defensive line. The fighting was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed, a cosmic-scale collision between the galaxy's most ancient civilizations and its youngest, all united against an enemy that represented extinction itself. Horde bioships died by the thousands, but they kept coming, endless and relentless, absorbing losses that would have broken any rational force. The elder races, remembering what humanity had taught them, fought with a ferocity they had forgotten they possessed. Ships rammed into horde formations without hesitation. Entire fleets self-destructed to create kill zones. Species that hadn't raised weapons in 10,000 years rediscovered what it meant to fight for something greater than individual survival. And humanity, scattered across the defensive perimeter, fought with the desperate courage of a species that knew it was witnessing its own last stand. Admiral Okonkwo commanded from Indomitable's bridge, now positioned in Earth's orbit, watching as the defensive sphere contracted under horde pressure. Every report brought news of destroyed ships, shattered fleets, defensive lines collapsing. The casualties were beyond comprehension, billions dead across all species, the largest loss of life in galactic history. And still the horde came, driven by whatever passed for determination in a swarm consciousness, seeking to eliminate the threat that had done what no other species had achieved, hurt them. The final defensive line broke 72 hours into the battle. Horde bioships breached the orbital perimeter and descended toward Earth itself, ready to consume the birthplace of humanity and eliminate the weapon they believed would destroy them. On the surface, in a facility deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, General Zhang stood before the activation controls of humanity's last gambit, surrounded by personnel who had volunteered to remain to the end. The weapon hummed with power that bent space itself, reality warping around it in ways that made human perception struggle. Zhang's hand hovered over the activation sequence, ready to trigger a detonation that would end the Horde and humanity in one mutual annihilation, when Ambassador Chen's voice crackled across the communication system. "General, new intelligence. The Horde is pulling back." Zhang froze, unable to process the words. "Say again?" Chen's voice carried a mix of disbelief and hope. "The Horde is retreating. They're abandoning the attack. All swarm elements are pulling back beyond the heliopause. They're leaving." The command center erupted in confusion. Retreat wasn't in the Horde's nature. They consumed or were consumed. There was no middle ground, no strategic withdrawal. Something had changed, something fundamental enough to override the Horde's primary directive. The answer came from the Valkyrie Chancellor, transmitted across all frequencies. The elder being's voice carried harmonics that suggested something close to laughter, an emotion crystalline consciousness wasn't supposed to experience. "They learned," it said simply. "The Horde incorporated human neural patterns into their swarm consciousness. They gained the capacity for human thought. And in doing so, they gained the capacity for human emotion, fear, self-preservation. The understanding that some victories cost too much. The implications rippled across the defensive fleet. The Horde had adapted to human warfare, had incorporated human cognitive patterns, and in doing so had become something it had never been before, rational. It had calculated the cost of destroying Earth, measured it against the certainty that humanity would trigger the Omega weapon and eliminate them both, and made a choice that no previous iteration of the Horde could have made. It chose survival over conquest. In trying to become a better predator by incorporating human thinking, the Horde had lost what made it unstoppable. It had learned to fear extinction, and fear, that most human of emotions, had made it vulnerable. The war didn't end immediately. The Horde still controlled vast territories, still posed an existential threat, but the momentum had shifted. Over the following months, human-led coalitions pushed back Horde incursions, reclaimed lost systems, demonstrated again and again that the cost of continuing the war would exceed any possible gain. And slowly, and possibly, the Horde began to change. Bioships that had once been mindless components of a swarm intelligence began exhibiting individual variation. Horde formation started prioritizing preservation over consumption. The swarm consciousness fractured into smaller, independent groups that could think, plan, and most remarkably, negotiate. First contact with a post-transformation Horde entity occurred in the Proxima system, where a lone Horde bioship approached a human patrol vessel broadcasting in 17 languages. The message was simple. We understand now. We understand caused. We understand fear. We understand why you fight. Teach us to be more than hunger. The human commander, a captain who had lost her entire family in the war's opening battles, faced a choice that defined humanity's character more than any battle, revenge or redemption. She chose to listen. And in listening, humanity taught the galaxy one final lesson. The apex predator isn't the one who kills the most. It's the one who knows when to stop killing. 10 years after the Battle of Earth, Ambassador Chen stood in the Hall of Eternal Deliberation, no longer as a petitioner, but as a full member of the Infinite Council. Humanity had earned its seat not through ancient wisdom or technological achievement, but through the willingness to fight when fighting was necessary, and the wisdom to show mercy when mercy was possible. The Kreshtar Horde no longer existed as a singular entity. In its place were thousands of independent biological collectives, each one incorporating aspects of human consciousness, each one struggling to understand what it meant to be something more than appetite. Some thrived, learning to trade and cooperate. Others failed, unable to reconcile their predatory nature with rational thought. But none of them threatened the galaxy anymore, because they had learned what humanity had tried to teach from the beginning. That survival requires more than strength. It requires knowing when strength isn't the answer. Chen looked at the assembled representatives of the galaxy's elder races, and saw in their expression something that hadn't been there when humanity first arrived. Respect, certainly. Gratitude, absolutely. But more than that, recognition. They saw in humanity a reflection of what they once were, before they chose enlightenment over effectiveness. And they saw the path that humanity offered, the possibility that wisdom and war weren't opposites but complements, that a species could be both civilized and capable of violence, both peaceful and prepared for war. That was humanity's true gift to the galaxy. Not the tactics or the courage or the sacrifice, though all of those mattered. The real gift was the reminder that evolution isn't about transcending your nature. It's about understanding it, accepting it, and choosing when to unleash it and when to restrain it. Humanity was the apex predator not because humans were the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced. Humanity was the apex predator because humans understood what it meant to be predators and chose to be more than that. And in teaching that lesson to the galaxy, humanity proved that the greatest strength isn't the power to destroy. It's the wisdom to know when destruction is necessary, and the courage to show mercy when it's not. That was the war that proved humanity was the galaxy's apex predator. Not because humanity won, but because humanity showed the galaxy how to be savage and civilized, fierce and compassionate, warriors and peacemakers. That was what it meant to be human. And the galaxy would never forget it.